Hello everybody, my name is Jer and welcome back to my channel. We are going to be continuing our discussion about Dead Like Me. We are going to be discussing Season 2, Episode 8. This episode is called The Escape Artist. This episode is interesting because it talks about, in the beginning with Georgia's monologue, about clubs, how Georgia never really was a part of a club, and she's brought this up before, that she doesn't really do group activities. It's not her thing. And we think that might be a central theme, but it's actually not really. There are elements of that which come into play. For the most part, the theme of this episode is kind of murky. This is one of those episodes that is just really good on its own and it doesn't really need something to tie it all together with a central theme. We've been getting so much content the last couple episodes, and this time we kind of just get to see them having fun. So this episode features no appearances by Happy Time, which is kind of a bummer. This episode tackles a lot of issues surrounding the last family, but there's also a lot of relationship dynamics that we don't really get to see. A lot of what this episode does is it pairs people up in pairings that we haven't really seen before. So the first pairing that we'll be talking about is Georgia and Trip. She gets a country club reap and she goes and she meets this cute boy named Trip. They have an immediate sexual chemistry, which is something that was brought up in the last episode about this kind of sexuality that's bubbling up with George that we haven't really seen before since the first season where she had her first kiss with Ronnie. And in this meeting with Trip, she very much is interested in him. He seems interested in her. They're both so opposite of what they're used to. They're so out of their norm. Trip is used to comfort and kind of luxury and repeating the same thing over and over and over again. He always has a predictability factor in his life. Georgia has that too, but hers is a little less structured. And so they both meet each other and she's got that kind of unstructured thing that he doesn't have and he has that structured thing that she doesn't have, and they both immediately click to the point where they end up kissing. But the most interesting part of this whole dynamic is that he doesn't tell her who he is, and when she finds out that he potentially is her reap, she tries to leave, and George knows that leaving is not an option, that she's got to do her job. But in this case, she was willing to go and just not take his soul, which what would that have meant? Would his soul have just lingered around if he had been her reap? The other interesting thing is that George did not use her undead name, and we've seen that now 2 episodes in a row with the last one where she went to the rock concert. She gave her dead name. She didn't say that she was Millie. She referred to herself as George. And that was interesting because George is getting a little sloppy with her reaps. Do I say hi? This is Mason. Hi. So it turns out that this guy Trip is not actually her reap, it's his dad that's her reap, which is even worse. She takes his soul and she promises to look after Trip. And when she goes back to their Waffle House later, she and Daisy are talking about it, how this guy is potentially her first boyfriend. And she says, what do I have to lose? And Daisy says something that I think is always particularly interesting and gives me a lot of chills. Daisy says, everything. You know, George has everything to lose if she gets into a relationship with somebody who's alive and it doesn't work out. Maybe he finds out who she is and then she's in trouble. Or if something happens to him and she falls in love, she won't die. He will. That could be even worse, falling in love with somebody who is eventually going to leave, or that you will have to leave because they're going to find out that you're not aging with them. There's a lot of factors that go into the Reapers dating people who are alive that the show doesn't really get to address, but there's a lot of implication. The next duo that we'll talk about is Daisy and Rube, and this combination was magic right from the beginning. Daisy doesn't have an assignment, Rube does. They go to a school, and Rube acts really weird around kids, and we're gonna find out why soon. They go to this school, and Daisy volunteers Rube to be the substitute teacher because she wants to be entertained. Rube does a really terrible job at being a substitute teacher, kind of scares all the kids, and Daisy's just trying to encourage him to do his best. Rube has one of my favorite moments in this episode because one of the kids asks what he's gonna teach them that day, and he just very sharply says discipline. What is interesting is that this is Reggie's school, and this Komodo dragon ends up getting out, and the janitor dies because I'm assuming the principal tried to catch the Komodo dragon, but also she seemed to want to kill it, but she had a big mop in her hand and she swung it around the corner and ended up killing the janitor, which I've always thought was a little weird because, like, why would she be holding a mop and trying to kill the Komodo dragon, but why would she swing it at human height level and not at the ground when the Komodo was running on the ground? It's comparable to that episode where the jewelry security guard shot the woman in the alley, but he was aiming for the small child who had stolen her purse. It's one of those weird Dead Like Me deaths that I'm like, this is just strange and suspicious, but it is what it is. When they get back to their Waffle House, Rube ends up buying a little oatmeal cookie for George and has Tiffany warm it up. And George makes an interesting comment that anytime he goes to buy her food or desserts, there's some bad news that's attached. And he tells her that he just wants to leave his girl with a smile. And that line is interesting, the way that it's framed. I want to leave my girl with a smile. George is not his daughter, but he's always treated her like a substitute daughter. He even calls her Peanut. And that's a pet name that he doesn't give to anybody else. He has a special admiration for George. And to constantly be buying her sweets and treats is a sign of how much he actually cares about her. Reggie gets locked into a duo in this episode as well. She gets locked with a character named Francis, who we're gonna see again in another episode. He's presenting the Komodo dragon to everybody at school, and he asks Reggie to be his assistant. And she doesn't really seem to be bothered either way. But what she does find interest in is the Pet Reaper shows up again. We see him one more time, and he's at the school to claim the Komodo dragon, which is a really nice little touch into the series. But Reggie notices him, and she notices that he touched the dragon, and she chases after him and leaves school to talk to him, and she asks if he knows a girl named George. And there's this fascinating moment where you can see this twinkle in her eyes where she can tell that something is going on, and she seems to be aware about the Reapers. And the Pet Reaper says, was she killed by a toilet seat? And Reggie's like, yeah, that's her. That's who I'm looking for. And he says, yeah, I've heard of her, and then leaves. And you can tell that Reggie is suspicious, that she's always been looking out the window thinking George is around, that she's coming to check on her and checking on her mom. And now this kind of amplifies those suspicions even more. When Grandma Phil ends up picking her up and she explains that this kid might know who George is, Phil gets really concerned, understandably so, because everybody knows that George is dead, but here Reggie is really thinking that George is alive and around somewhere. So then we'll talk about Phil and Joy, who are lumped together in this episode, and we get to see more of that tension that was building in the last episode, except this time it's to a boiling point, because we find out all this backstory that Phil is a free spirit. You know, she's always been that way. She has this energy where she's just gonna do what she wants to do. She's living in her own universe. And when Joy was a kid, Phil was just running off. She lived on a llama farm for a little while Joy was a kid, and she even went to jail because of a Richard Nixon protest. And a lot of Joy's compulsion seems to be driven by this kind of loose, free living lifestyle that her mother had, that she saw how irresponsible her mother was by having a kid and then just running off and doing her own thing and never really connecting with Joy, that Joy now feels like she has to, you know, control everything and keep her hands on everything and all of her fingers and all the pies. And they talk about Reggie, how Phil is worried about her, that, you know, her issues are buried too deep and that there's something going on there. She talks about how Joy just is too compulsive about things. Joy is too controlling. She needs everything to be a certain way and to be neat. And how that compulsion is what pushes people away. And that's what ended her marriage, essentially. And she tells Joy that life is messy and she needs to get used to it, and just throws everything off the top of the dresser to prove a point. After they make amends, they both talk about how they never really seem to find a resting place with each other, that they never really can see eye to eye. They're always looking at each other, but kind of looking in a different direction. And this kind of sense that Joy is to this and that Phil is to that. They're all always so distracted by that they never really connect. It explains a lot about Joy as a character, and it informs a lot about her decisions. It also helps us understand why that relationship is so broken, and possibly why Joy has such a hard time building relationships with other people. The only example she ever had was a disconnected mother. So then to our last pairing, which is Mason and Roxy, and this is my favorite pairing of all time that's ever been on the show, and they have some of my favorite moments just because of their on-screen chemistry. Jasmine Guy and Callum Blue just have so much chemistry with each other. It's evident that they had a lot of fun in doing this episode. They get some plane tickets. They have 2 reaps, one each, to get somebody on this airplane that's run by Travel National Air, or TNA, which is very cheeky. They both are just kind of having fun, and we get to see this delicate side to Roxy that we haven't really seen. She lets a lot of that guard down when she's doing her reaps and when she's doing her job that we don't really get to see when she's with the group. She puts on this hard exterior for everybody. And while she was doing this job, she was just so relaxed, easygoing, a lot like how she was with the French woman who died at the airport. But also, she just shot somebody last week, so maybe she's now completely reevaluating her worldview. One of my absolute favorite moments in the entire series happens in this episode with Mason. He sees that the alcohol cart is right next to them, and he tells Roxy to open her bag numerous times, and he's whispering it. He's grabbing all the little baby alcohols and he's dropping them into Roxy's purse. And the funniest thing is that this is very anti-Roxy's personality. She doesn't steal. She doesn't take things that don't belong to her. That's a Daisy thing. But she's so quick to acquiesce to Mason being ridiculous, and it's so opposite of what we've seen from her that it's so refreshing. It's nice to see him being paired up with Roxy because they're such opposites. He almost makes her a little less responsible, which is hilarious to see. But also, she helps him become, slightly more responsible and paying more attention to his surroundings and looking around and noticing who he needed to get before it happened. They have this moment at the end of the episode where they're both sitting on the plane because it never got to go to Cancun, and they're both just sitting there drinking, talking about how it would have been fun to get away, and they would have had a fun time together. And it's a really nice, peaceful moment that we don't really get very often, especially because at the beginning of the episode, Mason was clipping his nails at the breakfast table and pissing off Roxy. So it was kind of nice to see this tender moment where the two of them are at peace and they're both just like bummed that they didn't get to go on this trip and how much fun they would have had together, because ultimately they do like each other and they are essentially a family. So now 2 points that happen at the end of the episode is we see Rube flipping through phone books. He's got tons and tons of phone books and he's making phone calls and he's like crossing names off lists, and this pertains to the letter that he got, and this is a nice foreshadowing moment that we got from him. But then the other important moment is that we see George call the house again, and instead of getting Reggie or Joy like she normally does and just sitting there mouth breathing into the phone and listening to them, she gets to talk to her grandma, and she talks to her for just a few seconds. And I think George is just so taken aback that her grandma's there that she's willing to talk and say, oh, I'm looking for the lady of the house, and try to keep her grandma on the phone just a little bit longer. And in lieu of a favorite quote, because this episode had a lot more visual interest than I think dialogue heavy interest, but there's a moment that is subbed out for my favorite quote of the episode, which is, I think this is the only episode that I don't have a quote for. This scene where George is talking to Phil has my favorite musical cue in the entire series and franchise, and I think about it a lot and it gives me goosebumps every single time. It's this really soft, beautiful violin that's playing in the back right when Grandma Phil says, "Who is this?" I think Phil knows that it's George. I think there's something in the back of her mind, something that kind of raises the hairs on the back of her neck that make her think this could be George. Especially after all this talk with Reggie about how George's spirit is around, how this kid at school knew George and knows George actively, that maybe something is starting to arise in her, that she's starting to believe that. And it is such a beautiful little musical cue. And I think about it so often. I think this is the only time that it's used. I can't think of many other times that it's been used, if it has been at all, but it's my favorite musical cue of the entire franchise. Overall, this is a fantastic episode, and it was really fun to watch it over again. I really enjoy this one. It's such a nice change of pace from what the rest of the season has been giving us in a different way than like the shallow end was. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.